Well, hello, everyone. I'm James Dobson, and you're listening to Family Talk, a listener-supported ministry. In fact, thank you so much for being part of that support for James Dobson Family Institute.
The United States has a rich Christian heritage dating back to its earliest days. Many of our founding fathers were committed believers and purposefully integrated faith into the framework of America. Their deeply held beliefs in divine providence stemmed from a devoted clergy of pastors. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield were largely instrumental in the First Great Awakening. They saw themselves not only as biblical teachers and caretakers, but as major influencers on the culture. The ideas of freedom and independence that defined America's revolution originated from the pulpit. Those 18th century ministers are our focus today here on Family Talk through a fascinating presentation from historian David Barton. Now, before we hear that speech, let's listen to Dr. Dobson's thoughts about this broadcast when it aired previously.
I've been looking forward to this program for some time because I heard it delivered live not long ago, and it is a vintage presentation by David Barton. It's appropriate that we devote our program today to this discussion of how our early leaders laid the foundation for this country with such enduring wisdom and discernment. I mean, God had to have helped them, and what they did, our Constitution and our founding documents have guided us now for more than 230 years, and as we will hear in a few minutes, the hand of God was evident in everything they did. Well, let me introduce David Barton to our listeners. He's going to talk about the Black-Robed Regiment, and that is the name that the British gave to the American clergy during the struggle to establish our new country. David is the founder and president of Wall Builders. It's a national pro-family organization, and he holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Oral Roberts University, and he has done extensive research on the early days of our nation, and he's written a number of books on the topic. I believe in this man, and I've found his perspectives to be historically accurate and reliable, and he also has a very large library of original books that go back to the 1700s and some of the books in the 1800s, and he has studied these texts intensively.
Well, Mr. Barton does do a great deal of research into the topics that he is passionate about, so let's hear some of his insightful words about the Black-Robed Regiment right now on Family Talk.
In so many ways, we have been blessed as a nation. And if you look at the absolute ways that we are blessed in our prosperity, 4% of the world's population, 31% of the world's wealth or GDP, and our stability. No other nation's been 235 years under the same piece of paper. All this comes together to create what we call American exceptionalism. Now, this is where we get it a little different today. Most people can't define what this is. It's a blessing that we enjoy. It's something that God has given us. There's a lot of reasons for that, but they really can't define it in a tangible way. And because of that, when we look in textbooks about what creates it, we say, well, kids, who are the leaders responsible for what we enjoy in America? And invariably, we'll go to our political leaders. We'll say, well, it's folks like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Hancock, John Adams. There's just a number of political folks they'll go to, which I find fascinating because when you do go to John Adams, if you read his writings, when he was asked this question 40 years after the American Revolution, a whole new generation's come along that didn't see what happened. They said, where'd all this come from? He said, well, if you want to know who's behind what you enjoy today, he said, right up top, you have to have folks like the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper. He said, you've got to include the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew. You've also got folks like the Reverend Dr. Charles Chauncey. Oh, and don't forget the Reverend George Whitefield. All these guys were part of who he points to. And today we might know who Whitefield is, but the chances that we can say anything about Cooper or Mayhew or Chauncey are slim to none. Now, why in the world would John Adams have pointed to a bunch of preachers and say, these are the guys behind what we enjoy today? And it's very simple. If you go to the Declaration of Independence, when you look at every single right that is set forth in the Declaration of Independence, and rights that have never before been written down. When you look at those rights, what's striking is historians have documented every single one of the rights set forth in the Declaration of Independence had been preached from the American pulpit prior to 1763. Now what that means is the Declaration of Independence is nothing more than a listing of the sermons we've been hearing at church in the last 20 years leading up to the Revolution. I mean, we don't think of the Declaration in that sense, but we do. We're very blessed at Wall Builders in that we own about 100,000 documents from before 1812. And I own thousands and thousands and thousands of these founding sermons and sermons preached over the last 300 years in America. And when you look at them, there are some fascinating, because one of the things that had a huge impact was what was called an election sermon. And they created what we now know as the Black Regiment. The Black Regiment was what the British called the preachers in the American Revolution. And it didn't matter whether you were Catholic or Protestant, if you were black or white, Hispanic, everybody wore those black clerical robes. And the British said if it hadn't been for the Black Regiment, if it hadn't been for the clergy, they said America would still be a happy British colony. It was the preachers that they blamed. So because of that, they singled preachers out. See, we don't get that today, that the church was responsible, that they were the ones targeted by the British. But that's literally what happened. It's because of the sermons we preached. I mentioned that election sermon. And the first recorded election in America is in 1619. Now, that election that happened in America in 1619, at that point we say, you know, we believe that government's ordained by God, and as we look at government that is ordained by God, we believe out of Romans and out of 1 Peter and out of Titus and Timothy, all these other places that's ordained by God. So the question is, what kind of government did he give us here in this country? And the answer was self-government. We get to choose our own leaders out of Exodus 18:21. And so starting in 1633, what they did was they started preaching an annual sermon that was called an election sermon. Once a year, churches got together and they said, look, here's the government that God's given us. He's told us to choose our own leaders. Here's what you need to remember. And it was passages like Exodus 18:21, Deuteronomy 1:15 and 16, Acts 6 and 7, Proverbs 29, all these other passages that talk to us about how to choose our leaders and the right type of leaders to choose. So from the very beginning, we had these sermons. These sermons went for 270 years. This is the longest traditional form of sermon in America. This was a sermon not preached every election, but preached every single year. Nehemiah, trying to rebuild the city, get it back to God. Nehemiah dealt with economic laws, military laws, he dealt with marriage laws, he dealt with immigration laws, he dealt with education, he dealt with every conceivable issue. We used to be able to say, hey guys, as you're looking at legislation, here's guidance from the Bible. Now see, if we tried to do something like that today, you know, like I know, they would scream to heaven that that's unconstitutional. You can't do that. Time out. It's the guys who wrote the Constitution who are doing this. I mean, how's it unconstitutional when they're the ones who are actually doing this? Now, we got all these sermons, but you know, we used to preach on a whole bunch of topics I've never even thought about preaching on. Let me just take you through some of the old topics. This is the cry of Sodom. This happens to be the occasion of homosexuality being discovered in 1674 in a community. It was in the news, therefore it's in the pulpit. And you will find the sermons I'm going to show you, whatever was in the news, we dealt with in the pulpit because we wanted to make sure there was a biblical perspective in everybody's head about what was going on in the news. If it's in the news, that's going to be a secular view. You need to know how God thinks about these things that are in the news. So here's one on sodomy. Here's a sermon from 1681, a sermon on judges. Why on judges? Because that's a really big deal. Isaiah 126 says that the righteousness of a nation is dependent on the type of judges you have in the nation. And that's certainly the case with us. I mean, it's not legislatures that are telling us we've got to do abortion on demand. It's judges who've told us. It's not legislators who say we can't have prayer at graduation. It's judges who've told us. It's not legislators who say, oh, you can't have 10 commandments. It's judges. The whole issue of righteousness is judges. And that's why whether it's Psalms 2, 10 through 12, or 2 Chronicles 19, 6 and 7, whether it's Ezra 7, 25, all these passages deal with judges. So we had sermons on judges because that's a biblical issue. It's not a political issue. That's a biblical issue. Now what happens is we preach biblical issues and they say, oh, that's a political issue. No. The Bible was there before government was there. So we precede them. We can talk about these issues before American government ever popped up. Here's one from 1755, Religion and Patriotism, the Constituents of a Soldier, Good Soldier. This is a sermon that was preached in the French and Indian War as a group of soldiers were being deployed to go out to battle. Stop, let's have a sermon. Let's see what God says about soldiers. What's the proper role of soldiers? What's the proper role of war? It's not that God's for war or against war, they're biblical principles. So we used to look at all that type of stuff. You may have heard now that one of the things we have done in this year, because of a lawsuit filed, we no longer teach what's called the Christian It's called the Christian just war theory. That's what they taught in California, at Pendleton, elsewhere. You got soldiers going in. You need to know what a just war is because you want to be able to handle your conscience. If you have to do something, you want to know that you were on the side of, but we don't want to teach that anymore because that's a biblical perspective. You know how hard that is on soldiers not to know what a just or an unjust war is, just to go kill because somebody says so? See, we used to have a biblical perspective on how to go to war and what the Bible says about it. In the same way, here's a sermon from 1766. This is a lot of fun. Discourse is another word they use for sermon. This sermon is preached by the Reverend Dr. Charles Chauncey, one of those guys singled out by John Adams. It's also, you see here, good news from far country. You'll recognize that from Proverbs 25:25. Look what the sermon is about. This is a sermon, as you see here, on the occasion of the repeal of the Stamp Act. And just out of curiosity, when's the last time you've done a sermon on a tax repeal? Probably been a long time. Why would we do that? And it's not that we're opposed to taxes. We're told in Romans 13:6 the reason we pay taxes is so the government can bear the sword in our defense. We know that Jesus told Peter, you go catch that fish. When you get the coin out of its mouth, you pay your tax, you pay my tax. Jesus was not anti-tax. The Bible's not anti-tax, but it is so good on taxation that it tells us what type of taxes are good and what type of taxes are bad. See, these are very practical things, but the Bible deals with them. For some reason, we've quit messing with the practical things out of the Bible, but that's why we had sermons back years ago about things like taxes and things like economics, because the Bible deals with that. Here's another sermon. This next sermon, voice of warning to Christians on the ensuing election of a president of the United States, 1800. This election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, preachers stood in the pulpit and said, all right, we got two guys running for office out here. Now this guy belongs to this party, he believes this. This guy belongs to this party, they say this. Here's what the Bible says. You know, based on the Bible, there's no way a Christian can support this guy and this party. Real simple stuff. Now, we would never think about doing that today. You know, IRS, 501c3, all that kind of stuff is a real problem. But why did we do it for 350 years? And if you don't know, we only stopped this in 1954 through a little amendment called the Johnson Amendment, a single line rider added to an appropriations bill that said, oh, if you're 501c3, you can't talk about this stuff anymore. Now, we did it for 350 years. How come we did that? Because there's precedent all over the Bible. Do you know Jesus could not stand in an American pulpit today and say what he said in the New Testament without getting in trouble from our government? You know, what a strange thing. In this land of free speech and liberty, Jesus couldn't even say what he said in the New Testament. See, that's why we're getting to the point now, and we've done this now for 4 straight years with Alliance Defense Fund and others. There's 4 constitutional violations to saying pastors have to be controlled by government for what they say in the pulpit. Nobody's ever sued the government on that. So we've been trying to sue the government for 4 years, but they won't take the bait. They won't come after any preacher. And that's because no preacher in American history has lost his 501c3 for anything he said in the pulpit. And for the last 4 years, we've been saying really big things in the pulpit, begging the IRS to come after us. We can't even get them to come after us. IRS knows, like we know, that if this gets in the court, it's going to be unconstitutional. They would rather have a few hundred pastors say anything they want than have 370,000 pastors find out that you really can't regulate what's said in the pulpit. Now, you know, I can take you through hundreds of others, but the question is, why in the world would we preach such sermons for all these hundreds of years in America? And the answer is real simple. It's because of 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17. You'll recognize the first part of this passage. It says, in 2 Timothy, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. As far as I'm concerned, that's the most important doctrine in the Bible, because that's what tells us the Bible's inerrant, inspired, and infallible. If the Bible's not true, you can't believe anything else in it. So you have to start with that as a primary doctrine, then you can believe the other truth that's there. But verse 17 tells us why God gave us an inspired Scripture. Why did God give us an inspired Scripture? And the answer is very simple. Verse 17 says that the man of God may be complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work. Now, the word I would choose to emphasize there is the word every, because I think our definition of the word every is a whole lot smaller than God's definition of the word every. And I don't mean that in a sliding way. I mean that because our culture has changed the way we think. It particularly has come out of the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary. I mean, starting back in 1947, the court said, you know, religion's a really, really important thing. You guys, it's so important, you've got an entire First Amendment to protect your religion. But here's what we need you to do. From now on, we need you to practice your religion in private. We need it in church or home. We don't need it out in public. I mean, if you love a nativity scene, you put it up on the mantle Christmas time, that's great. Let's just not have it out in the city park. And man, if you like to pray, you pray all you want to, but just do it before you go to the football game. Let's not pray at football games anymore. And if you think the 10 Commandments are great, put one up in the foyer of the church. Let's just not have it in courtrooms anymore. So what's happened is for 50 years now, we've been told that your faith is important. You just got to practice it at home or church. You can't practice out in public. Now, the result of that has been that it's changed the way we think. I love the passage out of Romans 12, verse 1 and 2. In the King James, it says, "Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." I love it in the Phillips translation. Phillips translation says, "Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold." And in a very real sense, we have let the secular world tell us what our role in the world is to be. It's the very opponents and enemies we have defined the role of the church. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. And that literally was not the way it had been. You go back to John Adams, the comment he made that he thought was so cool about the American Revolution. He says, "The pulpits have thundered." Literally, that's what shaped America. And that's why the British again called them the Black Robe Regiment, the Black Regiment, because those black clerical robes. It was the preachers who shaped the way everybody thought, the way we went at policy, the way we looked at everything. Now, within that framework, 100 years after the Revolution, there was a church historian named Bishop Charles Galloway who went back and studied all these preachers in the Revolution, and this was his conclusion. I love what he said about them. He said, "Mighty men they were, men of iron nerve and strong hand and unblenched cheek and heart of flame." And I don't think that's the way the New York Times describes preachers today, but that's the way preachers were described back in previous generations. He continued, he said, "God needed not reeds shaken by the wind, nor men clothed in soft raiment," Matthew 11. "He needed heroes of hardihood and lofty courage, and such were the sons of the mighty who responded to the divine call." It's amazing how many of our military generals were actually pastors leading people out to defend their rights. See, this is what we had, and significantly, historians from that period, for example, you take Reverend J.T. Hadley, great historian, wrote a great book. We have it on our website. You can just download the whole book and read it. It's called The Pastors and Clergy of the American Revolution. Really cool stuff about these guys. But he talked about them. He said, you know, the patriotic clergy of the Revolution were the soundest statesmen of the times. And that was really true. You look at that document under which we've governed ourselves for 235 years, you take the Declaration, where'd they get all the ideas? Notice what Malachi 2:7 says? "The priest's lips should keep knowledge, and the people should seek the law at his mouth, for he's the messenger of the Lord of hosts." People used to say, "Hey, we don't understand the law. I'm going to go ask the pastor." Really? Today we'd say, "I don't understand the law. I need to go ask an attorney." No, back then we understood whether law was good or bad based on what the Bible said about that. So people went to the pastor to get statesmanship, to learn laws, to learn legislation, to learn government. I mean, the Bible's a source of all that. And that's what you see when you look at the Declaration, because of the 56 guys who signed the Declaration, 29 of these guys had seminary or Bible school degrees. Imagine that. More than half the guys who signed the Declaration were ministry-trained guys. See, we used to understand the biblical application to every aspect of life. If you look in 1776, after they did the Declaration, they now had a need to create state governments, because we've abolished 13 colonial governments. No more royal governors. We got to have state governments. It was the preachers who were writing the constitutions. I mean, these are all noted preachers who wrote state constitutions in the early colonies. And as you move out from that and you look even at what happened in the Constitution itself, we have 55 delegates who got together at the Constitutional Convention. Most people could never mention all the preachers that are in there. All these preachers in there. And you know, there was a time they went for 5 weeks and they were having fights and couldn't get along and whatever. And that's when Franklin called for prayer. And Washington records in his diary that while they didn't do prayer, they took 3 days off and went to church. They specifically went to church at the church of the Reverend William Rogers. William Rogers had these guys in church, and he prayed a prayer over them. That prayer is so significant, it appeared on the front pages of the newspapers of the day. It says, "As this is a period, O Lord, big with events impenetrable by any human scrutiny, we fervently recommend that thy fatherly notice that august body assembled in this city compose our federal convention." See, he's praying over the whole Constitutional Convention right there. He says, "Will it please thee, O thou eternal I am, to favor them from day to day with thy immediate presence? Be thou their wisdom and their strength. Enable them to devise such measures as may prove happily instrumental for healing all division." I mean, he's just praying. Everybody knew that they were fighting and couldn't get along, and said, "God, heal this. Bring them back." Do you know, they got back together and only 10 weeks later finished the Constitution. And strikingly, if you look through that document, it is amazing how many biblical clauses appear in constitutional clauses. Biblical verses and phrases, you'll find them through so many concepts. The Founding Fathers pointed to Bible verses as the source of those concepts. See, today we're oh no, government's secular. That's that compartmentalization again. They never believed it was secular. They looked to God to be included in everything they did, and that's where so many of those great ideas came from, was right out of the Scriptures. And so what you find is after we finish the Constitution, you need to get it ratified. You got to send it off to 13 colonies, and they got to, where do you send it to ratify? Oh, you send it to the state capitol. No. You're in Massachusetts, you're in North Carolina, you're in other states. You know where the state ratification convention was held for the federal Constitution? It's held churches. Really? And in each state, you had to elect specific delegates to go together and ratify the Constitution. 44 of the delegates elected to ratify the U.S. Constitution were ministers of the gospel. I mean, there was nothing in their mind that cut ministers out. It was because of ministers that we had this thing. It was because the church was involved. Now, after you get the Constitution done, you got the first Congress, now you need a Bill of Rights. And so we come back with the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Yeah, and it's amazing how many preachers were in that first Congress that helped frame this Bill of Rights. And they gave us the First Amendment not because it guarantees separation of church and state. That's no such thing. It guarantees the free exercise of religion. They weren't trying to secularize the public square. They wanted to make sure that you could include God in those areas. So this literally is what we have. And when you look at who we are today and if it hadn't been for the church, we wouldn't have the country. Now, we don't teach that much in history anymore, but the documents are really clear. So let me close out by taking you back to this thing about we can't let the world squeeze us into its own mold. I mean, we got to take, we've got biblical precedent, we actually have historical precedent, we have lots of constitutional precedent, and then we got secular precedent. And it's the secular stuff that's overriding the constitutional, overriding the historical, and overriding the biblical. And we can't let them squeeze us into that mold. I want to close out with the comment from Reverend Charles Finney. You may remember him. He was born under the Founding Fathers, grew up listening to the speeches of George Washington, John Adams, and all those guys. He was very significant in the Second Great Awakening, that great American revival. And as he saw the Civil War approaching, and he was so involved in civil rights, so involved against slavery, so involved in abolition, and as he saw the Civil War approaching, he wanted to remind the preachers in his generation, you got this conflict coming, the church cannot sit on the sidelines. The church is what drives the culture. Look what he told preachers in his day. He says, brethren, our preaching will bear its legitimate fruits. He says that immorality prevails in the land, the fault's ours in a great degree. He says if there's a decay of conscience, the pulpit's responsible for it. He says that the public press lacks moral discrimination, the pulpit's responsible for it. He says if the church is degenerate and worldly, the pulpit's responsible for it. If the world loses its interest in religion, the pulpit is responsible for it. If Satan rules in our halls of legislation, the pulpit is responsible for it. He says, if our politics become so corrupt, the very foundations of our government are ready to fall away, the pulpit's responsible for it. He said, let us not ignore this fact, my dear brethren, but let us lay it to heart and be thoroughly awake to our responsibilities in respect to the morals of this nation. It comes back to us. We're the guys that were there to create this thing at the beginning, and if it gets away from us, it won't be their fault, it'll be our fault, because we far outnumber any secular forces out there, but if we muzzle ourselves and stay silent and won't get engaged in this thing, we've just given it away.
And that's certainly a challenging end and a sobering reminder from David Barton to conclude this Family Talk broadcast. The church and its pastors are ultimately responsible for the integrity of this nation. Congregations everywhere must step up and proudly stand against this morally decaying culture. You've been listening to a gripping presentation from David Barton about America's Christian Foundation today here on Family Talk. It's incredible to me how instrumental God and the Bible were to our founding fathers. Unfortunately, many in our society deny that history and are attempting to blot out Judeo-Christian values. Let's listen to Dr. Dobson's analysis of this struggle, which was recorded when this program last aired.
We really do need to pay attention to what's happening in this country. I am appalled at the ways in which the name of God or any mention of Him is being removed from our culture and society. You know, that started back in 1962 with the Supreme Court's removal of school prayer and then Bible reading and the Ten Commandments on the wall. And from that time to this, there's just been a concerted effort to remove God from our courtrooms and our currency and even our Pledge of Allegiance. And there's no limit to what those who who are opposed to the Christian faith, such as the ACLU and the Freedom from Religion Foundation and many others, want to do. And I do hope our listeners will contact us for information about David Barton's organization, Wall Builders, and to find out ways that they can get involved in protecting religious liberty in this country, because it's hanging by a thread today.
Well, friend, you can visit today's broadcast page at drjamesdobson.org to learn more about David Barton and his organization. Wall Builders is an excellent resource for you and your family to get to know America's true history. That's drjamesdobson.org, and then tap onto the broadcast page. Do you want to know more about the threats to our Christian values and our heritage? Then be sure to contact us for a copy of Family Talk's broadcast collection titled America's Spiritual Civil War. This 2-disc set includes Dr. Dobson's meaningful interviews with conservative commentators Dennis Prager and David Horowitz. Now, these conversations will open your eyes to the all-out assault against religious liberty and our nation's Christian foundation. Request this broadcast collection by calling 877-732-6825. That's 877-732-6825. Or you can go online to drjamesdobson.org and click on the Resources tab. That's drjamesdobson.org, and then click on the Resources tab. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for joining us and for faithfully supporting this ministry. Tune in again Monday for another edition of Dr. James Dobson's Family Talk. I'm Roger Marsh. Have a safe and happy 4th of July weekend, everyone.
This has been a presentation of the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute.